Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Catherine Kane. I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center. Welcome to Student Stowe Prize Day and the public program called Inspiring Action, Real Stories of Social Change.
Let me first welcome Martese Johnson. He's a fourth-year student at the University of Virginia who was awarded $2,500 for his winning entry, Reflections After a Trending Hashtag. Johnson's a South Side Chicago native, will be the first in his family to graduate from a four-year school. In his third year at UVA, he encountered the unfortunate experience of falling victim to excessive force by alcoholic beverage control officers near the campus. He spent much of his time since advocating for minorities who experience police brutality and various other forms of social injustice. He's spoken on a variety of media outlets all around the world, and he's got a lot of interesting work that he'll be telling you about that he's doing next in his life. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Stowe Prize student winner, Martese Johnson.
I'm a Chicago native, one of 7 brothers, and raised by a single mother on the south side of Chicago. And from there, I somehow became the first and still the only of my brothers to attend and graduate from a four-year university. But that was not an easy accomplishment for me. I can never be more thankful for what I got from the University of Virginia, and I would recommend that anybody go there. But I've also had very many hardships at the university, whether it was in my first year of college, realizing I wanted to pledge a black fraternity because when I attended the white fraternity houses, they would call me nigger and tell me I couldn't come in. Or, wanting to run for class president, but being told I don't think I was fit while simultaneously having the most votes out of every student. And so I had to use my normal Illinois identification card, which wasn't a driver's license, but was still a valid identification card. The mishap was that identification card had a previous address's zip code, and so the owner of the bar very kindly said, "We can't let you in today. This is not the correct zip code." And those officers perceived that as me being turned away for some sort of violence or belligerence, I guess, or whatever other assumptions one might make that those officers may have thought. And so this small miscommunication and mishap between me and the owner of a bar who was very friendly with me and also spoke to me about being from Chicago, he was from the Morgan Park area, ended up in my bloody abuse in front of hundreds of my peers across the street from a university where I thought was my safe haven.
Our high school student Stowe Prize winner is Nina Sachs. She's a junior at Francis Parker School in Chicago, Illinois. She'll be awarded for her work empowering women, period. Women's rights are extremely important to her. She recently started a group at her school called Tampon Tuesdays, which works to raise awareness, supplies, and money for women in need in the Chicago community and around the world. In conjunction with her work with women's rights, she serves as youth liaison for Her Story Theater. It's a company for social change which produces plays about sex trafficking, domestic violence, and homelessness. Please welcome Nina Sachs.
I've always been really fascinated and passionate about women's issues and rights. And it wasn't until last year that I read this article on Nicholas Kristof's blog that sort of outlined the issue of there being a lack of access of affordable feminine hygiene products, both on an international and domestic level. More reading about it, I came across this really stunning statistic, which is that the #1 reason why girls in underdeveloped countries drop out of school is because of their periods. And the way that happens is that because especially in developing countries, purchasing tampons or pads is very, very expensive, even as it is in the United States. But so they usually use reusable material, either cloth or reusable pad. And that's not always reliable or sanitary. And so when they go to school, when young girls go to school, they have fears about leakage or embarrassment or being, harassed by their fellow classmates. And so they will return home for the days of the week that they have their period and go back to school for the rest of the month. But as a result of that, they fall behind in school for missing, 5 days a week out of every month, and subsequently are forced to drop out. Tampons and pads are extremely expensive. A woman will spend close to $150 a year on her period, which is $18,000 in a lifetime. I started this club called Tampon Tuesdays, which hosts events on the first Tuesday of every month, either movie screenings or bake sales or sticker sales. And the way it works is that you can pay in money as you traditionally would, or you can pay with tampons or pads, which I thought would be really interesting. And at first I was unsure how it would be received by my peers, but I was very happily surprised. People were very enthusiastic about it. And what was really interesting to me was that my fellow male peers would go up to their friends and ask for a tampon or pad because they wanted a cupcake. And then they would hand me that tampon or pad. And I think there's a lot of stigma and silence and mystery around periods and feminine hygiene products.
But why do you think more hasn't changed around the stigma around this and the cost and some of the difficulties you're talking about?
The stigmatization is so driven into the culture. And I agree, women have definitely, taken large strides, especially in the last few decades. And I think the fact that conversations about removing the sales tax on tampons and pads and even having them be free is definitely a step in the right direction.
And our Student Stowe Prize keynote for today is Andrew Aydin. He's co-author of the #1 New York Times bestselling graphic memoir series called March, which chronicles the life of Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis. Co-authored with Representative Lewis and illustrated by Nate Powell, March is recipient of the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, Special Recognition, and the Coretta Scott King Book Award, and Author Honor. The Washington Post called March a must-read monument. He is a graduate of Trinity College here in Hartford, so it's a bit of a homecoming for him. He serves as digital director and policy advisor to Congressman Lewis in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Andrew Aydin. Andrew, I'd love for you to maybe, before we talk a little bit about some of your work, I'd love for you to maybe give me some thoughts about what you've heard from these two students just now, maybe about some of the connections that you can make to the work that you do, because look, I've covered politics for some time, and I'm often dubious about whether or not politics is the place to solve some of the problems that we're talking about here today. But I guess maybe give me some of your thoughts about what you've heard so far and some of the things that resonate with their stories.
I think it's easy to envision female leaders sacrificing their own needs for get the funding or whatever it is for the children. But I think broader than that is the ingrained stigma that anything to do with women's rights has in our culture. I was raised by a single mom. I can remember her pulling up in front of the Eckards, which is a drugstore in Georgia, and sending me in to get tampons for her. The cashier looks at me, she says, "Are these for you?" I'm 8 and lippy and say yes. And walk out. I think for so long we as a country have portrayed Leave It to Beaver as this ideal, that what we aspire to. That in some ways we've neglected the uniqueness of the non-white cultures. Oftentimes the congressman will be asked, how'd you do it? Why'd you do it? What is it that motivated you? And he'll say that we have a mission, we have a mandate, we have a moral obligation to speak up and speak out. And I think these students are embodying that. I think we have to look at ourselves and what it means to be a citizen. It's not just voting, but voting is the first step. It's showing up. Where is the push to bring voter registration fully online or voting online? Why do we accept these arcane rules that end early voting? Why do we let the redistricting process get so out of whack that the craziest right-wing Republican is still facing a right-wing challenge? We just have to recognize what tools it is we're going to use and how hard we're going to have to work to make it happen.
Older people don't have the same expectations of young people anymore. They don't expect us to work. They don't expect us to learn certain skill sets. And they don't expect us to lead large groups of people at all. And so for that reason, there are so many more institutional barriers that have been put in place to actually prevent us from doing those things. And so the key to social media for young people, for millennials, is that it's reopening those barriers. It's breaking those barriers down. And so you may not let me sit at your boardroom table or whatever, but I can put out a tweet that'll get more attention than anything you said in that meeting to those leaders. And then those leaders will have to respond to that anyway.
I think social media has to be used for more than discussion. It's a great avenue to get your voice out. But this technological question of how do we use it to get people to physically show up, whether it's to a rally or to the ballot.
Yeah, it's definitely been a huge tool for me because I go to a pretty small school. And it was really important to me once I sort of got off my feet with my club, spreading my message around, and obviously social media is a huge tool for that. Although most of my peers were pretty receptive to the cause, some of them, of course, chose not to listen. And I think social media can be a way to force people to listen. Some of my friends from different schools and different states even saw what I was doing and asked if they could also start something similar at their school.
The thing that every protest movement has had to grapple with is how do we get people who don't think like us to come over to the other side, or at least to work somewhat on our side. I don't know, do you think about that at all and worry about how to get the person who just like would never want to see a picture of a tampon on their Facebook feed to listen to what you're saying?
I think for my cause, exposure is really important. And so on social media, and even like in my school when I was hosting my events, just having people know that tampons were just freely floating through the school was really helpful. And so I think it takes a lot of patience and persistence. At least that's what I found.
Being more of a familiar black face, it's easier for me to get into more trouble. And I feel like I have the personal burden of having to walk a very thin line and possibly not even be myself, because being yourself as a minority in America sort of puts you in a place to be hurt in many different ways.
I mean, I'm not going to ask you for the whole thing, Andrew, but I mean, what's a remedy, perhaps, for some of this that we haven't quite arrived at? I mean, what's something that
Doing away with student loans.
Doing away with student loans.
Look, we need an activist generation to deal with all of these problems, and they are myriad. And it's almost every minority community has a systemic problem, whether it's the Muslim community being profiled, whether it's the Latino community being profiled and put in detention camps when they may just not have their driver's license on them. But fundamentally, we are not going to have an activist generation until we do away with student loans. Because if your first concern in college is what am I going to do for a living the day I step out of here and pay down this six-figure debt, then you're not even thinking about activism. But it was the young people of SNCC, it was the young people in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia, in North Carolina, who were 18, 19, 20 years old when they started the sit-in campaign. If you're arrested in college, you might lose your student loan ability, so you can't keep going to school. We have systematically shifted the financial burden of higher education from the corporations who receive the benefit of a trained workforce to the individual to train themselves. I believe if we can get an activist victory on student loans and in turn get rid of them, you will see the rise of an activist generation who will be able to address fundamentally the systemic problems that we face. They won't fix them overnight, but at least they'll have reinforcements. At least these folks won't be standing alone, and at least it won't be the rich kids who are the only ones who can do it.
They look at the John Lewises and the MLKs, and they seem disheveled and anxious and afraid that we don't have the same capacity to make that kind of change. And so what I try to leave every university and every engagement with is that we are literally in the same position that he was, in the same age range, with the same resource, more resources, way more resources. And we have so much capacity to create change throughout this country, and we just have to believe in ourselves. And so it just takes us standing together and understanding when we see something that's wrong, not to say, man, now I'm gonna have a bad day. We say, okay, we're having a bad day today, but tomorrow we're gonna do something about it and make sure tomorrow's different.
Do you think that in some ways more female leadership, and not just in Congress, not just at the tops of corporations, but in the top position in America or anyplace else, do you think that that actually changed people's minds about things like what you're talking about? That, I mean, it takes having female leadership to make us think differently about very important issues that are very basic to women and that just seemingly aren't basic to men.
Yeah, I think it's actually, I think that makes a huge difference. The people who are bringing up the issues of removing the sales taxes on tampons are women. And it's not even something that I had thought about, and I wouldn't expect it would be something that a man necessarily would think about either. even though, you know, they should be aware of it. So yeah, and I think just having the more representation that women have in any role helps diversify and give perspective to any issue.
Most importantly, and I'll start with you, Martese, what are you doing next? Like, what's the next thing that you do that you want to make an impact with?
So I have a long-term strategy, which might seem selfish initially. So
we like people with long-term. Nobody has those anymore. That's actually really good.
So the goal is I'm going to start working consulting in New York City pretty soon. It's a weird startup kind of consulting firm that allows me to have some autonomy in my work and allows me to be more creative. And hopefully in the coming years, get into some entrepreneurship. This is a really big goal. I want to have a lot of money by a very young age. And then
no one's ever thought of that before. That's completely unique.
And after making that money, hopefully become a good Donald Trump. So someone who can influence society via their capital, but in a positive way, and also represent communities that have, in my life at least, that I've always been connected to, who have struggled, and hopefully from there, you know, do some good for the world. And in between, obviously, I still want to do more activism. I still want to get out to DC when I can and talk to people, and still want to take my weekends for vacations, but also take my weekends to do good things for people. So
I'm still a junior in high school, but I'm looking forward to next year continuing my work with Tampon Tuesday and hopefully spreading it to more schools both around the Chicago area and you know, hopefully across the country as well. I think a really important thing for me is to continue educating new people about it because I do feel like my school community at least has sort of a baseline idea of what the problem is, but it's important that a wider group of people also have an idea, because I think that that's really the first step, is just education and awareness about the topic.
I'm going to release a book in August. It's a load off. March finally being done is sort of one of those moments where you have to step back and look at your life and say, what do I want to do? I was telling somebody today that when I finished the last book, I cried. Because for the last 8 years, every day, no matter how bad things got, I knew I had something to do. And Congress isn't doing anything. So I really don't know. For the first time in a long time, I really don't know. But I do want to talk about your point about compassionate capitalism. I think sometimes, well, first of all, Donald Trump is the manifestation of our priority of profits over humanity. Hands down. But how do you make something that is both good for people and good for the bottom line? I think March is one of those things. 2 more printings and I'll have my student loans paid off. Tie that all back in. And that's my fundamental problem. I don't want to go lobby, which is what it seems like all too many of my colleagues are doing. They go on the Hill, they don't make money, they get a little student loan repayment, but then they go work for a larger company and they lobby, and that's how they get their money. And I think it symbolizes in some way the fundamental question of our society. How do we all have a good quality of life, make things and be treated relatively equal, and keep capitalism? And I have no idea.
I want to thank these inspiring people and this inspiring place, and of course the inspiring organization that brought them all together, the Stowe Center. A nice round of applause. Thank you very much.